Well, good afternoon after, I know, a really long day for you, and we're winding down to the end. Without knowing, your backgrounds for all of you, and where your understanding is, where this relates to those, particularly the facilities and the management and the handling of things during ripening, during degreening or conditioning, many ways that you want to talk about it. Sort of what we know so far as it relates to food safety and some of the expectations that are coming along. Food Safety Modernization Act and raw agricultural commodity facilities conducting all of the types of events and post-harvest handling practices that you've been talking about. Just out of curiosity, how many here in the room have taken the Produce Safety Alliance training for growers? A couple. How about the preventive controls for human food? Oh good, I think I'm safe then. So I won't bore you to tears necessarily for that reason, for other reasons maybe. So I'm really going to focus on a lot of where the emphasis is, this Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, as well as its intersection with industry or market access expectations. A lot of the focus trying to gain knowledge, trying to fill in knowledge gaps about what the risks are, how best to prevent, how best to have or develop corrective actions if necessary. Mostly around Listeria. There are other pathogens of concern. Some of our own studies doing the risk assessment as it relates to avocados, looking at the survival of bacterial pathogens during ripening and handling of avocados. And then really emphasize with Listeria environmental monitoring programs, which are rapidly increasing both from a regulatory mandate as well as an industry mandate for facilities and ripening rooms. And I'll just tell you up front, luckily I can end this day with some good news and get an idea of where a lot of the research direction is going now, looking at the microbial community, the associated organisms that are on fruit that may be affecting the survival, the persistence, and limiting the growth of pathogens. And like many other labs, we're applying these new technologies that are possible now because the cost has come down to events from the farm all the way through ripening. So one of the first questions for those of you that haven't had to go through this, or maybe your responsibilities don't really have to cover this, but somebody, I would assume, in your organization or as an affiliated stakeholder is aware of the FSMA produce rule or preventive controls rule. So am I defined by a farm? Probably you're thinking, why would that be a problem? But we're talking about the FDA. So, it can be a little bit squirrely. And again, I'm not going to go into gory details, but just share with you why these things become important in terms of what the expectations are and what your operation or one of your clients or your customers' operations may have to cover. Am I defined as a secondary activities farm? I'll explain what this is. Or am I defined as a facility? So, a primary production farm, packs, holds raw agricultural commodities. Again, I'm not going to read this to you, but basically, if you're doing anything that's not considered true processing or manufacturing, but it can include drying, dehydrating, such as raisins, although a lot of that happens in the field. But this is where it intersects with, I think, the subject of this course. Artificially ripening or helping to ripen, condition, degreen, such as degreening tomatoes in a controlled storage room. This is FDA language, in a ripening facility. You would be considered a farm if this is done on what's considered a secondary activities farm. And that's an operation not located on the primary production farm. It doesn't have to be physically located where you're farming. They finally came to recognize that you don't have to have contiguous acreage. It can be spread out. But basically, you're not part of the farm per se, but you're majority owned by the operator of that farm or multiple primary operators collectively. You still with me? Okay. And then you also have to then handle the majority of these racks from your production on the farm. So again, it's really all of the regulations that define whether you're going to have to do something or you should do something. So that's FDA regulated or industry requirement. Depends on whether you're defined as a farm or a facility. So again, all of these different types of operations, including ripening, can happen on the secondary activities farm. Therefore, you would be under the produce rule. Therefore, the requirements, expectation, documentation, record keeping, requirements for validation and verification, record keeping are all less onerous than if you are at a facility. Again, don't worry about this whole list. You can look at it. I just highlighted a couple of things that makes a difference in terms of how you handle the product, where it's coming from, what service you may provide, or what you're doing within your own operation. So again, blending, commingling, conditioning for ripeness, artificial ripening, degreening, repacking, waxing, loading for transportation, all of these are encompassed in the FDA's definition of what a secondary activities farm would do. So what if I'm not defined as a farm? So that would be a non-farm business that packs, holds, and stores, does all exactly the same things, potentially, or more commonly, that a secondary farm or a primary farm facility would, but you must register. So you must register with the FDA. It applies to domestic and foreign manufacturers and processors, domestic and foreign packers. So again, if you're doing any of these post-harvest handling practices to condition, to ripen, degreen, whatever those things are, and all the other activities that were on that list, you would be considered a facility that had to register, as well as for storage, and it's generally covered by the preventive controls for human foods rule. Again, I'm not going to go into gory details. You can look into it. Doesn't appear that many of you personally have to deal with this, but I imagine somebody in your organization likely does. And the real purpose is to really provide FDA for cause as well as for inspection, which they now have the authority to do, to determine the location, the source of potential outbreaks or intentional contamination, and quickly notify facilities that may be affected, put out warnings and etc. One thing that's important to note, if any of those activities happen in retail, the Food Safety Modernization Act does not apply to retail establishments. Conditions commonly associated with fruit ripening and conditioning generally favor pathogen survival, whether it's bacterial, viral, or parasites. And the biggest question is, are there conditions that would allow for growth of the bacterial pathogens, and on what commodities? And there hasn't been a lot of work on that. There's been some, and part of it, to be honest, is because people up until very recently haven't wanted to ask the question and haven't been compelled to ask the question. So survival and growth on the product can lead to internalization, and certainly if there's growth, if you increase the numbers during subsequent handling, whether it's repacking, handling in wholesale, handling in retail, handling in food service or food preparation, can lead to cross-contamination. And the other component is a lot of focus based on large recalls that have happened and large outbreaks that have happened, survival, growth, and these productions of what are called biofilms, or things that bacteria produce to protect themselves from cleaners and sanitizers. That's the primary reason to be concerned about that, but they can lead to cross-contamination from the facility in multiple ways to a product that's being handled, it's being ripened, that didn't come in from the field, didn't come in from the orchard or the farm in a contaminated condition, and has been suspected to be responsible for long-term sporadic illness. That means isolated cases, but over a long period of time, and there's a lot of building evidence to show that is true. So very quickly, I'll just say, we tried to engage the industry, seeing that this was coming quite a long time ago, put together a little extension bulletin, and pretty much, nobody cared. Nobody was interested, but then events happened. Again, I'm sure, hopefully you're at least aware of it tangentially, and United Fresh and a group put together this Listeria guidance. Again, just highlighting this because if you want some background, if you want to know a little bit more, or if it comes up, there's a very nice document that goes through this. So one of the things that happened under FSMA, preventive control, so if you're a registered facility, it's required. If you're a secondary activities farm or a farm that's doing any of these practices, pretty much industry is going to, if you haven't already been hit with this as a requirement, as a specification, as a supplier. Industry is way ahead of regulatory, but for a registered facility, it's mandatory that you at least evaluate. And there's a much broader definition of ready to eat and puts a great emphasis on having these environmental monitoring programs in place. A lot of it focuses on this Listeria, monocytogenes, the really key pathogen of concern, although Salmonella also could get involved. Just for a point of information, FDA did put out a guidance document for what they expected for Listeria management, control, monitoring, and response. The comment period is over, so they're currently processing a lot of public comments, a lot from industry, again, around all of this. Not going to go deep into the biology, but just a little bit so you understand why the preoccupation, why the intense focus on Listeria. There's a lot of different forms. There's two that really are of concern. The main one is this Listeria monocytogenes. It's pathogenic to humans. Although there is enough overlap that sometimes in the testing methods, one will give you a false indication that it's there, which can cause a lot of havoc. But the main reason for the focus on Listeria is, although the number of cases is very low, you can see compared to Campylobacter, another bacteria, Salmonella, we're in the millions. The number of deaths proportionally is extremely low. So although sickness can be, pretty devastating, the mortality rate is nothing like what it is for Listeria. So very few cases annually, a large number of deaths. So the current figures that they use are about 25% of those infected, and there's a lot of issues with the susceptibility, who's most susceptible, very elderly, very young. But some of the recent outbreaks, the death rate has been as high as 35%. So clearly, it has everyone's attention. So some of its characteristics that relate to coming into a facility where you're handling it in the post-harvest environment, where you're handling product to get it into bins or to get it into cases to go on and ripen. It's unlike Salmonella, unlike E. coli. It can infect an animal host, it can infect a human, but it doesn't need to. It lives very well in the soil, it lives very well in the rhizosphere, so around roots of plants. It's commonly found in surface water, in the sediments of water bodies. It loves to grow in things like silage, coal piles, decaying vegetation. It does thrive in moist, cool locations, but it can very easily live, grow, and persist in warm, wet locations. And one of the key things is that will grow, depending on the temperature, under refrigeration or refrigerated temperature. So it can grow down close to 0 degrees C, obviously very, very slowly. At typical handling, temperatures for ripening, conditioning, or degreening, it can grow very readily. And in the animal host, it can be invasive. Just from a side point, when we have an outbreak event or a suspected outbreak event, which is one of the reasons I couldn't be with you for the rest of the program. There's a new thing going on, unfortunately. The incubation period can be very long. So 60 days or greater. Once you find out that there's an outbreak going on, if you feel you have or you've consumed product coming from that source, there's a long waiting period to worry about whether you're going to become ill. Pretty scary. So why all the recalls? Way more testing, better techniques to detect, very targeted surveillance, again, that high mortality rate, a number of very large outbreaks, not just in the US, but worldwide, have really driven the public health agencies, state, local and federal level. There is, in the US, a zero tolerance on products, so a lot of testing triggers seemingly, weekly recalls without the evidence of associated illness. And the other, it's always been around, and we always say that there's a constant assault on any produce handling facilities from the farm and from the surrounding environment. Recent surveys, some that we've conducted here within my group, have shown a fairly high prevalence in produce handling facilities, including those that include ripening and degreening events as part of their normal practice. But the industry response is really showing some strong improvements. Just to go back very quickly to what's driving this, if you aren't that aware, I'll tell you that this is really what launched a lot of the current concern. Listeria on cantaloupe, 2011, 146 ill, 36 deaths. And the question is, where did investigators find the Listeria coming out of Colorado? Just kind of going through this pretty briskly, just to give you kind of a quick overview. A very high frequency of positives in and around the fruit handling systems, primarily around where one would expect, where there's water, where there's handling. There's some other nuances that really probably were the tipping point. But as you move from the farm, where they found none, to the packing facility where they're getting 31%, into their coolers, into their cold room, 50%, out into retail, that number goes up to 94%. And what was really clear, as we and others got involved and came into it, is that in terms of their practices, room cooling alone took an extended time. The fruit went in wet, and at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which was the temperature of the room, we're able to show that Listeria will grow on an uninjured, intact netted rind about 100-fold. So, over that sort of time frame, you get a lot of growth. The other thing that we already knew that we also had, and others had the chance to then look at again and address, we did it first with Salmonella. Subsequently, because of this outbreak, looked at it with Listeria. Any kind of superficial mold that would grow on the outside of something like a netted melon or any other product where you might experience this, even if you really can't see it well, it creates a channel, it creates an avenue for that Salmonella or that Listeria to become internalized, in this case below the green layer right under the netted rind into the edible flesh. So any external treatment short of cooking is not going to kill it. You may have read about this. Again, here we are again, a large and growing outbreak of Listeria on cantaloupe. This one's in Australia, which you had a little bit more time to explore some of these things because they can relate to some of the other types of fruit that get handled. But in a retail display, I won't ask you to answer it because it's late in the day already. But anything concerning about you besides they're saying we know that these are safe, but cut, overwrapped, and I can tell you that this is at just ambient floor display temperature, unrefrigerated, not necessarily. And we now know from a couple of domestic surveys, retail surveys, a fairly high prevalence of Listeria, monocytogenes, and Listeria indicators at the point of purchase. So again, another place for handling to happen. One of the other key ones that really drove a lot of the current research that's going on was the stone fruit, the large stone fruit recall with Walnut fruit. Fortunately, they managed to survive that event, and they're still going. But one of the things that became apparent, again, as you walk through, this is a post-harvest handling contamination event, not coming from the orchards, widely distributed, not a lot of cases that linked it together, but what the FDA is doing, what the Centers for Disease Control are doing, are using their new technology in genomic profiling to link these sporadic cases together back to the supply and causing you to own it, if you will. One of the things that was interesting from this study that really helps us understand what would be some expected contamination levels in a packing facility, in the handling facility. We have very few opportunities to look at the actual fruit, many more to look at the environment, but not the fruit itself. FDA, of course, can show a badge, and they had access. So pretty unequivocal post-process contamination. I'll just go through this pretty quickly. This is one of those rare cases where the contamination level was so high, if they were doing finished product testing, they would have found it. If they were doing raw material testing only coming in, they would have not detected any. The point here is this limit of detection from the technique is down to about 5 cells per fruit, and they had a pretty high recovery rate for both peaches and nectarines. And about 25% of the nectarines were positive, 91% of the peaches were positive, all running across the same line, which is not too far off from some of our earlier studies, early back in the early 2000s, looking at relative survival on the surface of different stone fruit. I'll skip that. This is the important bit. So you can see from actually quantifying the recovery, what kind of numbers they got from the different types of fruit that were held and they hadn't been shipped yet, that came from that packing facility. So when you get into, it's hard to know, we all have our own individual susceptibility, but when you're getting into the hundreds and thousands per fruit, the likelihood for illness goes way up. So we don't know what then the survival would be in distribution, a lot of unanswered questions, but that's a pretty heavy load that meant that there was pretty uniform contamination during handling. The other piece that we've linked together, I'm switching back to salmonella just quickly, is that if there is decay, whether it's bacterial decay, whether some of the different molds, not all of them, some molds when they develop, they'll actually inhibit human pathogens, but when there's decay, even if it's small, it makes it more likely that the human pathogens will be able to grow on that produce item. This is called metabiosis, and it really, one microbe helps the survival and the opportunity for growth of another. And again, as I mentioned, which I won't get to for the sake of time, we're really trying to use that then for those that inhibit human pathogen survival and growth. Again, many of these molds promote the growth of salmonella in this case that may otherwise be incidental contamination. So just letting you know sort of what's in the resources. So to what extent do we understand or predict the survival of human pathogens along the supply chain or in simulated distribution? This is some pretty old data, but after we did this, everyone said, okay, enough, we don't need to know anymore, at least at the time. So if there's contamination and there's a rapid desiccation, which can happen, you can see that the bacterial pathogens, in this case salmonella, on peach, pretty much die very quickly, but then you always have that long extended survival. So you can get these low numbers surviving well out into to the typical shelf life and distribution. If they are going in wet, under typical holding conditions, you can see we did it under a number of different temperatures. Not wounded, they will survive for an extended period of time at higher numbers. If they are just lightly wounded, in this case lightly wounded meant we abraded the surface with typical brushes, so nothing you would necessarily see unless you looked under a microscope. You can actually, at permissive temperatures, in this case 22 degrees, so in the 80s, you would actually get a spike of growth on the nutrients released during that wounding. So again, things to consider, and then once again, if you have some developing decay on some of the fruit, the pathogens will benefit from that, will grow, and then subsequent handling could easily cross-contaminate and spread that to many other fruit. So very quickly, won't go into it. This is sort of some of the good news, at least work done, including Jeff Brecht in the back. Under typical tomato fruit ripening conditions, if it's there, it doesn't go away, but there's no evidence that there was actual growth under the degreening or ripening conditions. There are other studies that are looking at ethylene signaling effects on susceptibility of tomatoes to infection by salmonella. Again, just letting you know that there is research, there are studies that have looked at that. If you look closely at the impact of ethylene versus not ethylene on different types of ethylene inhibited mutants of tomato, you kind of have to squint your eyes to see that there's an effect, but sometimes, some places, but these are all wounded. So that was basically some of the background. And because of some of the concerns, FDA launched a avocado assignment where they were going out and randomly picking avocados, both imported and domestic, looking for evidence of contamination by salmonella and especially survival. We were asked to start a study. I'm just going to go through it pretty quickly. Sort of a summary of a lot of replicated trials. When contaminated by either pathogen, there's a slow decline depending on the conditions, depending on the temperatures, and you get stable populations, but no evidence for growth on an unwounded rind, no evidence for growth during ethylene conditioning or ripening, and no evidence of subrind transfer. So at least for avocados, under pretty typical conditions, no elevated risk if there are low populations on the external rind. Of course, you don't want them there in the first place. Although hydrocooling is no longer a common practice with avocados, there are still some operations that at least were using it at the time we were doing this study just a couple of years ago, and pretty easy to show that warm fruit in cold water will drive these pathogens into the subrind tissue. Pretty deep. So again, just sort of quickly, we have to take into account the the different ripening stages and maturity stages when we do these studies, so it gets a little complicated. But basically, Salmonella declines at a pretty moderate pace, just like most of the others. Listeria declines more slowly. They're sort of different bacteria, and can be pretty stable, particularly at lower temperatures. Trying to simulate what would happen if they were being held cold, ripen, and then move to more room temperatures, or sort of getting ready for retail display. Again, no rapid death for Listeria. They're pretty strong in terms of surviving desiccation, but you see this gradual drop off. So really then it depends where you start. And I'm just showing you this slide only to remind myself to say we try to account for the different incoming stages, the different ultimate ripeness stage under different conditions with different types of temperature management after inoculation. The same thing with a more mature, more ripe, moving to a riper one, looking at both Listeria and Salmonella and the potential for internalization and transfer. That was part of what we're asked to do. So again, the big thing is that they're going to survive on the external rind, but no evidence for internalization under those conditions. And again, taking them through different types of ripening conditions. Again, this is just to say we tried to really take into account a lot of different types of handling practices, but pretty much across the board you have no effect of ethylene. Although it looks like there's a difference, they're not statistically different. You just get a lot of variability fruit to fruit, which is pretty typical. And again, under different conditions, moving them out into warmer temperatures, no evidence for multiplication, but also very limited growth. Then the industry said, well, we understand why you're doing these low levels of ethylene, and that's because it's a flow-through system. That's all the avocados really needed. But we use much higher, so we moved it up to the average of what we were measuring that they were using, and we really found the same sorts of things. So don't expect die-off. Therefore, prevention is the best tool, but you also don't have to really be overly concerned with avocados and several other fruit that we've looked at that don't have time to go into. One difference where you can, we did show low levels of internalization, is where there are rind irregularities. So expanded lenticels is one defect. And again, if they're on the surface, they have the potential to get inside. So lastly, I'll just kind of end with giving you a little bit of a glimpse of what's going on in these environmental monitoring programs, which are becoming mandatory for registered facilities. The industry market access standards, supplier requirements are requiring for environmental monitoring, mostly for Listeria, but also for Salmonella. We go through a process, and that allows us to do source tracking of the isolates that we find, take us right back to where we swabbed, and then share that information with the facility that has been enrolled in these programs, and they direct their cleaning and sanitizing programs and help optimize those. So all of these baseline surveys across a number of commodities, predominantly tree fruit, although starting to get requests from some of the fruit vegetable folks in the same way, includes ripening rooms. And I'll just kind of give you a schematic. And if you're at all look at that and say, wow, that's pretty nice, it's Adrian in the back who is loves to do these things, like at 2 in the morning usually, right, Adrian? But kind of a summary of where we find the indicator Listeria, the human pathogen Listeria, or both together. And they're largely focused around wet operations, but you can easily see human traffic, equipment traffic, and movement will spread them in different places. We can then use different types of genetic profiling, some of the older version. Again, I won't go into the details, but it's called post-field gel electrophoresis, comparing that with the more modern techniques of whole genome sequencing and things that look very, very identical. Really, you would say that they're indistinguishable. By whole genome sequencing, you can show a much greater diversity, and it really helps us understand diversification within the facility, stability, or what we call now house pets or resident strains in a facility, as a way to look for moments of intervention. So again, the key thing here is that there appear to be, at least in that small subset that I'm sharing with you across years, across facilities, highly matched, even though they might be 100, 125 miles apart. cycling among the facilities, and they appeared sporadically in other facilities as well over 3 seasons. And one of the things that we found that I wanted to share with you, if you're ever in a position to share this information with others, not just avocados, but other commodities as well, one of the linkages, one of the points of cross-sharing of these isolates seems to be on bins. We only swab the external. We don't want to find something on a food contact surface, but pretty clearly you get a lot of movement of indistinguishable isolates around between packing operations that are also doing ripening. I said I'd end on some good news, at least I would consider it good news for the purpose of this workshop. So if you look across, in this case this happens to be citrus, but pretty typical. You look here in the degreening, 100% of them from a large number of samples were negative, even though in those same facilities, although these are grouped together, you can have very large prevalence of Listeria monocytogenes, a human pathogen detected in and around those operations. So not 100% true for everywhere, but certainly for avocado and citrus so far, I would consider that up to this point good news. So I'm going to end there because I think we're right about in a good place, and I'll stop with the 3-minute signal for if there are any questions or anything related to this that you'd like to explore. So thank you for your attention.